Good evening, everyone. My name is Tony Moore. I'm Director of the National Centre for Australian Studies and I suppose a little bit of a Marcus Clarke obsessive. Just to begin with, tonight we're gathered here on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation, and I want to acknowledge them as the traditional owners and pay my respects to their elders and to the elders of any other community who may be here tonight. And we may, as time goes on in our talk, get to some of Marcus Clarke's attitudes on Aborigines and issues to do with that in Australia's colonial past. This month is in fact 130 years since the death of Marcus Clarke, author for the term of his natural life. The convict saga that became in time an international bestseller and certainly made a mark in the 19th century. The milestone comes as Australia's enjoying something of a Marcus Clarke revival. We have a novel, Below the Sticks by Michael Meehan. We had at the State Library Victoria a play, The Future Australian Race, a few years ago. We have just released last year a biography by Clarke's school chum Cyril Hopkins, which was unpublished for over a century. And I'm happy to say I'm writing a history of Australian Bohemians that opens with an all-singing, all-dancing Marcus Clarke chapter. And I'm developing a TV documentary about his unnatural life. Now, tonight, to discuss the legacy of the late, great Marcus Clarke, I'm joined by Robyn Annear and Des Cowley, writers, cultural historians and curators immersed, I believe it's fair to say, in 19th century Melbourne and its literary milieu. Now, before I introduce them in more detail, I want to first give you the bare bones of the Marcus Clarke story. Now, many who have admired the psychological insights and the Gothic darkness of the term of his natural life imagine it to be the work of a worthy older Victorian gentleman. I know I certainly did. In fact, Clarke was in his 20s when he wrote the classic, a young maverick whose fast life as a celebrity columnist of Melbourne's urban comedy came to an abrupt end in 1881 when he was only 35. Indeed, the book's provenance was far from reverent. It was first serialised as a magazine, and it is said that Clarke's editor locked him in the office with a bottle of whiskey to force the last chapters out of him. Now, with an ironic, self-deprecating wit, Clarke ate, drank and scandalised his way about Melbourne in the 1860s and 70s, setting up a string of underground literary clubs, titillating respectable society and keeping one step ahead of the creditors. He used to say, "It's no use borrowing money if you intend to pay it back." Now, along the way, he invented a new Australian character to challenge the bushman, the urban Bohemian writer. Now, he was an eccentric kid with family in the imperial governing class. His best mates at school were Gerard Manley Hopkins and his brother Cyril. Clarke was inspired by his reading of Balzac and Baudelaire to adopt the identity of the Bohemian and the flaneur, romanticising a privileged childhood, and I quote, lived indifferently in Paris and London and patronised by the dandies, artists and scribblers who form in both cities the male world of fashionable idleness. Now, when his father was committed penniless to an asylum, the 16-year-old dandy was forced to immigrate to, horrors of horrors, the far-flung colony of Victoria in 1863. Now, dispatched to the Wimmera as a jackaroo, the new chum imbibed the alien landscape, which he famously described as weird melancholy. Now, steeped in the Gothic aesthetic, in fact, he and the Hopkins brothers had written a story about reanimating the dead when they were schoolboys, Clarke found the bush to be funereal, primeval and a humbling place. I quote, "In Australia alone is to be found the grotesque, the weird, the strange scribblings of nature learning how to write." Now, in 1867, the 21-year-old Clarke made his way to Melbourne to start a career in the Argus in big city journalism. This is where he made his name. Scalpel in one hand and rapier in the other, young Marcus carved out a journalistic niche for himself as the peripatetic philosopher, a slightly bemused, cynical observer of the goings-on of Melbourne society. Now, his topical blasé style resonated with the city's humour. Remember, Melbourne is a young city. Most people aren't born in Melbourne. It's only 30-something years old, and it's in its post-gold rush metropolitan phase. Now, Clarke's targets included sharebrokers, new chums, our boys, the working man, politicians, Republicans, squatters, art connoisseurs, journalists, sporting men, Victorian ladies and larrikins, complete with their own peculiar slang or jargon, very much, on my reading of his columns, a colonial precursor to Barry Humphries. Now, what surprises in reading across Clarke's diverse body of work is the modernity and playfulness in his writing, whether sensational documentary investigations of the city's underbelly — yes, underbelly did not start recently — gonzo literary stunts worthy of the chaser, an optical device to broadcast the Melbourne Cup no less, and psychedelic accounts of smoking hashish, a band musical mocking the Victorian Premier, and his sophisticated literary essays, short stories and novels. Now, long before Melbourne had The Monthly, Clarke inaugurated the Colonial Monthly, a national magazine of ideas to push new writing and emerging writers, before there was even an Australian nation. When this failed, he started a humour magazine called Humbug and a pantomime starring his actress wife. Clarke's sense of the cutting edge is revealed in expose journalism about walking the wild side of Melbourne's lower Bohemia of opium dens, brothels and criminal warrens. Yet he remained the cultured dandy dedicated to conversation, clothes and cafe society. And across this diverse project, I think flitters his greatest creation, himself. He presided over a creative HQ at the Café de Paris in Melbourne's Theatre Royal, and then set up the Yorick Club, named after its mascot, a human skull, and that is the original skull that Robyn has brought in tonight. The Yorick Club was a circle of writers, journalists and poets that included Henry Kendall, George Gordon McRae, Henry Giles Turner and Adam Lindsay Gordon. Now, at its core, Clarke's bohemianism, like his journalism, involved transgression across the barriers of social class and middle-class morality, flirting with the bourgeois nightmare of downward mobility, disgrace and ruin, the fate of Rufus Dawes, the character at the centre of his great novel, and sadly a fate that overtook the young author. Now, although born of a family of empire builders, he became a harsh critic of British imperialism's treatment of both convicts and Aborigines, and ignited a 19th century version of what we would call history wars. Clarke's fall from grace owed as much to his public attacks on Melbourne's commercial, political and religious establishment as his libertine lifestyle and bankruptcies. Despite the popularity of his natural life, a shunned and very much insolvent Clarke died prematurely from erysipelas, not syphilis, erysipelas, which was brought on actually by pleurisy, which was likely brought on by drinking a lot of alcohol in a St Kilda's slum in 1881. Now, Clarke was young, hip and dangerous to know, a self-confessed goth, a Wildian wit and a punk in the age of steam, an iconoclast rather than an icon. Yet he was also a member of the Melbourne Club, feted by the socialites and invited to all the balls. Tonight, our panel will try to get behind the various masks of this prolific writer to consider his legacy and relevance for us today. Now, I want to throw now to Robyn Annear. Now, Robyn, as I mentioned, is a historian, a curator and an award-winning writer. She sits on the Library Board of Victoria and guest curated the library's 2006 exhibition Naked Democracy, governing Victoria 1856 through to 2006. Some of her books are The Man Who Lost Himself, The Unbelievable Story of the Tichborne Claimant, Fly a Rebel Flag, The Eureka Stockade, and A City Lost and Found, Whelan the Wrecker's Melbourne. So I reckon, Robyn, you know Melbourne pretty well. How does Clarke, Melbourne and term of his natural life fit together?
I'm going to focus on his natural life, which was the title of the book. I think throughout Clarke's own lifetime, only afterwards was For the Term of added to it. And as a reader, I've got to admit, skimmed his natural life until I was preparing for tonight. About 20 years ago, I spent some time doing working on an archaeological survey of the west coast of Tasmania around the banks of Macquarie Harbour, and so spent quite a bit of time in his natural life territory. And as an act of historical research, I skimmed the relevant chapters of that, and it seemed in keeping with the landscape that I was plunged into, plunged far deeper than I would ever want to be again, I've got to say. So that was fine, and I thought, really, in retrospect, that's pretty terrific, seeing as the man never went there, but he captured something essential of that place. But that was my only dealings with his natural life. Really, I've encountered Clarke far more in his witty, urbane, Bohemian, cynical, blasé persona, and particularly in his sort of scrapings of Melbourne's underbelly, his lower Bohemia and so on, totally, absolutely draw me in, and I've loved those. So sitting down and really coming face to face with his natural life, which is the monolith that overshadows Clarke's life and reputation, was frankly a bit of a shock, and I'd have to say a letdown. Let me tell you some of what I have written here. A workmate of mine, a younger woman, said to me about 6 weeks ago that she was, just out of the blue, that she was thinking of reading for the term of his natural life. It was one of those books that she felt that she should read, which is a reflection of her youth, I would say. And I said, well, look, hold off. I'm plunging myself into that right now in preparation for this, and I'll let you know, whether I think it's worth having a go at. And I would say to her now, don't do it. Life's too short. Why would I say that? Well, to quote a biographer of Marcus Clarke, who was actually referring to another of Clarke's stories, it possesses little to stir interest in a modern reader, is my take on it. Now, I'm certain that Tony and probably Des have a different take on this, and I'm interested to hear about the psychological insights and so on. But to me, it's certainly of interest, but very much as an artefact rather than as a living literary entity that I feel I can extract much pleasure, I would say, from. But as an artefact, I say that because it makes me, it makes me walk around the thing and examine it from all sides and wonder, what was he thinking, and what were his readers thinking, that they were drawn in week by week to this serialised production. Certainly it's replete with sensation, and when you think about it being written in that way, and think about Clarke, after all, being a journalist, and obviously drawn to the seedier and darker aspects of life, both on the surface and beneath the surface, it's understandable that it's as dark and dire as it is, of course, also given the subject matter, but that it was a critical as well as a popular success. Really makes me reflect on 19th century people and what the hell it was they saw in this thing, because, as Tony says, it was a bestseller. It was translated into several languages. It was published in the US, although I believe a more an upbeat ending was fashioned for the US market. It must have appealed to that fascination with human suffering and depravity, which never goes away, the interest as well as the depravity, not to mention sensation. It's still apparent in the popularity of misery memoirs, which are just, going gangbusters out there, and reality TV, of course. Most of that kind of production, however, end with the triumph over adversity sort of ending, or the glimmer of light. None of this in the book version of his natural life. Though it could be argued that Clarke's ending with Rufus Dawes and Sylvia escaping from the tyranny of life and achieving perfect union in death counts as uplifting in a way. But really, the relentless aggregation of horror and brutality and inhumanity, his natural life, it's really, I found, misanthropic, and as anything that you'd read from the pens of J.G. Ballard or Chuck Palahniuk in the modern day. It's just dark and desperate, and at every turn things just get worse. Human nature, again reflecting on this psychological aspect, human nature is shown at its bleakest and most reprehensible, I would have thought. But his natural life wasn't originally intended to be this way. The book started life, as we know, as a serial. It ran for 2.5 years. It was meant to run for just 12 months, about twice as long as it was meant to go. And serial format at least partly accounts for the sensational nature. How better to keep readers coming back month after month. And interesting, I mean, Clarke was 23 when he wrote when the first instalment appeared. He was 26 when the serial ended. And the story, as published in this serial format, ran to 370,000 words. In order to reduce the length for book publication, Clarke took the advice of a respected critic and lopped off the first and last thirds of the story and added a new prologue which shaped the backstory and the initial motivations of his protagonist, Rufus Dawes, the convict. Now, the writer and critic Michael Wilding, who has studied Marcus Clarke and his natural life at far greater length than I have, tells us that in its original form the story was meant as a metaphor for the alchemical process. The original chemical setup leading to a long, drawn-out period of darkness, of confoundedness, literally of imprisonment of the metal, then transformation into gold as the end product. And the original story had a longer initial setup during which Dawes actually served as apprentice to an alchemist. This was prior to his imprisonment, as well as a lengthy section after he was freed, and with Dawes making his fortune on the Victorian goldfields and finding happiness with his lady love. So there was the gold. So in the book version, lopped at either end, only the darkness of imprisonment remains. And this is what I found just fairly painful to deal with. And you know, he might say, well, good thing, it was meant to be painful. So what's now considered a classic of the Gothic genre, some even particularise it as Tasmanian Gothic, was originally a fairly small school of literature, I believe, but nonetheless it is considered a school, was originally imbued with light as well as shade, and was a more conventionally moral tale with the wrongly convicted Dawes coming into his just reward. In the book he never does. Hope surfaces only to be dashed, goodness is trounced by evil, depravity, weakness, you know, you get the picture. If you accept that Marcus Clarke wrote his natural life to expose the brutality of the convict transportation system, to ensure that it was never repeated or revived, since transportation had actually ended in Australia by the time he wrote his natural life, then it's possible to view the book in the tradition of something like Uncle Tom's Cabin as protest literature, a cautionary tale showing the depths to which civilised humans can sink. But I'm inclined to wonder to what extent Clarke drew on his own experiences of being brought low, losing his prospects of a cultured, privileged life, and of course his emigration, which was a form of banishment, really. So to what extent did he identify with Rufus Dawes, humbled, disinherited and broken as a result of his father's failings? The thing is, up till now, it's his natural life that Marcus Clarke is largely remembered for, if he's remembered at all. And this is the achievement, this book, that Brian Elliott, his principal biographer, says redeemed him from the charge of mental trifling, which is how he summarises the sum total of the rest of his writings. I'm not so sure that it does redeem him from that charge, and I'll be interested to talk some more with these two gents about that as this evening goes.
I think the mental trifling redeems him. I think,
yes.
I think a new generation see echoes of, dare I use the awful word, postmodern, but a different sensibility in that the carnivalesque qualities of that. And we'll get on to that. But I'd like to throw now to Des Cowley, who has I'm sure most of us here know, rare print collections manager at the State Library, particular interest in artist books and the literary traditions of Melbourne, with over 20 years' experience with the library's rare books collection, and as also a curator, including the State Library's permanent exhibition Mirror of the World Books and Ideas. Now, Des, you've got a good bird's eye view of a lot of Clarke's texts, and I believe you've even rescued a few. Can you tell us about that?
Clarke worked, of course, at the Melbourne Public Library, as we now call it, the State Library of Victoria. But the points that occurred to me, and I think it's been certainly alluded to by Tony, the first thing that struck me, I felt the same. Clarke's age is a kind of revelation, to realise that that he wrote his natural life in his early 20s. He was dead by 35. If you, just to throw up a kind of another name, he was born later than someone like Henry James, and we think of James as a kind of modern sensibility. A writer championed by, Colin Toyman, Hollinghurst. So to kind of, I think it shifts my perspective to think of Clarke as a kind of younger man than Henry James. He would have been in his early 50s, writing in 1900 had he have lived. He could have been writing in the 1920s. So that's.
This is your what if there.
That's the what if question, and
World War I.
We may come back to this and decide that it could never happen, but it would have been fascinating to, of course, see, what would have emerged from this sort of, encyclopedic approach that Clarke had. The other thing that's extraordinary is just his literary output. It's beyond conventional imagination. If we think that I think, to apply for the Vogel Awards, you've got to be under 35. Clarke by 35 had just written thousands of pages of every form of literature, novels, short stories, plays, librettos, endless journalism. It's really
satire.
Quite extraordinary. Satire. There was, and we have at the library, Tony mentioned that one of his sort of foolhardy, I guess, sort of things he engaged in was the journal Humbug, which I think lasted 8 issues, a satirical journal. And we've got in the library's rare books collection Marcus Clarke's own copy of Humbug. And of course, everything's anonymous. And in Clarke's own copy, I think 90% of every single piece in it has MC at the bottom. It's annotated. He was virtually writing his own journal. And it really is quite, amazing to place that in sort of one human being, that the full range of activity that he was engaged in. In terms of his position within Australian literature at the time, it was the 1850s, 1860s was really a kind of birth period of Australian literature, and he was part of a generation of I guess, literary writers that came to Australia. And if we think of equivalents in painting, we'd be talking about Glover, von Gerard, people who arrived here very, very literate, and in a sense tried to kind of, begin a sort of national literature. They were very international in their perspective. And I think, Clarke, in a sense, really decided to sort of stay and make a literature in Australia. The model he looked at was something like Henry Kingsley's great, very, very famous novel of the period in the 1850s, The Recollections of Geoffrey Hamlin. And he saw that as the great novel of the period that he kind of aspired to equal, to better. He was very interested in trying to find national stories that would allow, I guess, Australian writers to tell their own story. He looked to the models he knew in London, Dickens, he looked to Paris, Balzac, Hugo, he looked to America and tried to work out what are the stories we can tell. And I think that led to him, going down to Tasmania. It led to him fossicking in the books in the public library, his own book collection, trying to tease out the stories that would allow him to begin to tell an Australian kind of narrative. Yes. And his natural life is really the story that he finds. And I guess, having read it again this week, I think it's a really powerful novel. It's sensational literature. It suffers from all the faults of 19th century literature. We'd say that about Dickens. the coincidences, the kind of the
coincidence.
correspondences, the unbelievable moments that you just think, you've got to be kidding. That happens in all literature during that period. And in a way, his model is it's the model of Dickens, Balzac, etc. And I think within that context, if we step back and read it as a novel of the mid-19th century, I think it's a really powerful novel, and I think it's one of the few novels in Australia, possibly the only novel, that has virtually never been out of print. Still available at $9.95 in the Penguin series.
It's interesting how rereading it when I was doing a book on political prisoners transported to Australia, how a lot of the language also echoes the narratives that political prisoners wrote, who were articulate, mainly bourgeois people, some of the most educated people that came to the colonies, and he has taken those and creates the gulag notion, which enters our DNA as how we see the convict period, because there are historians who look at the opportunities and how some convicts did quite well. So as a historical document, it has interest.
I guess there's that correspondence between the way that Clarke looks at Lower Bohemia in his journalism. He's attracted to, as the underbelly, the kind of lower class. In the sense, he's doing that with his natural life, because of course, yes, history has kind of judged the fact that most convicts, in fact, did well. He's looking at a very, very tiny percentage, and he's fascinated and interested in that. It's kind of, but I think more than just history, and I think someone wrote and described it as not so much a historical novel as a psychological novel. It's the story of a man whose soul is destroyed.
He wrote
and it goes beyond
the
history.
Gothic. People said, how can you have the Gothic in Australia? There are no castles and moats. There's no Catholic monasteries. How can you do the Gothic? And he said, the bush, and famously wrote about its weird melancholy, the bunyips oozing out of the slime, the Aboriginal skeleton men dancing at night. But then he said, but you find it in the convict system, the brutality of those evil silencing cells in Tasmania, those places of human torment and torture. And Americans like Wendell Holmes, who corresponded with Clarke, ticked him for getting this psychological element. So it was a modern Gothic that he's exploring, and it's really how we've continued often to do the Gothic, except the vampire films that we all enjoy. Robyn, I wonder whether you could bear reading a little bit from this novel. I know you were going to select a little reading, and then Des might have one as well. Just something short.
It's not too long. It's about midway through, and here we are. The mutineers of the Osprey from Macquarie Harbour were on trial. Major Vickers brought his daughter Sylvia, who had witnessed the mutiny but had since been struck by amnesia, amazingly. He brought her to the court to see if she could identify the accused through that haze, that amnesic haze. The girl had never before seen the ceremony of trying a man for his life, and the silent and antique solemnities of the business affected her as it affects all who see it for the first time. The atmosphere was heavy and distressing. The chains of the prisoners clanked ominously. The crushing force of judge, jailers, warders and constables assembled to punish the four men appeared cruel. The familiar faces that in her momentary glance she recognised seemed to her evilly transfigured. Even the countenance of her promised husband, Maurice Freer, bent eagerly forward toward the witness box, showed tyrannous and bloodthirsty. Her eyes hastily followed the pointing finger of her father and sought the men in the dock. Two of them lounged, sullen and inattentive. One nervously chewed a straw or piece of twig, pawing the dock with restless hand. The fourth scowled across the court at the witness box, which she could not see. The four faces were all strange to her. "No, Papa," she said, with a sigh of relief. "I can't recognise them at all." As she was turning from the door, a voice from the witness box behind her made her suddenly pale and paused to look again. The court itself appeared in that moment affected, for a murmur ran through it and some official cried, "Silence!" The notorious criminal Rufus Dawes, the desperado of Port Arthur, the wild beast whom the Gazette had judged not fit to live, had just entered the witness box. He was a man of 30 in the prime of life, with a torso whose muscular grandeur not even the ill-fitting yellow jacket could altogether conceal, with strong, embrowned and nervous hands, an upright carriage and a pair of fierce black eyes that roamed over the court hungrily. Not all the weight of the double iron swaying from the leathern thong around his massive loins could mar the elegance of attitude which comes from perfect muscular development. Not all the frowning faces bent upon him could frown an accent of respect into the contemptuous tones in which he answered to his name. Rufus Dawes, prisoner of the Crown. "Come away, my darling," said Vickers, alarmed at his daughter's blanched face and eager eyes. "Wait," she said impatiently, listening for a voice whose owner she could not see. "Rufus Dawes? Oh, I've heard that name before." Sylvia turned to her father with breathless inquiry in her eyes. "Oh, Papa, who is that speaking? I know the name. I know the voice." "That is the man who was with you in the boat, dear," said Vickers gravely. "The prisoner." The eager light died out of her eyes, and in its place came a look of disappointment and pain. "I thought it was a good man," she said, holding the edge of the doorway. "It sounded like a good voice." And then she pressed her hands over her eyes and shuddered. "There, there," said Vickers soothingly. "Don't be afraid, Poppet. He can't hurt you now." Sylvia gave a low cry and fell into her father's arms. "Oh, Papa, take me away. I feel as if I was going to remember something terrible." Amid the deep silence that prevailed, the cry of the poor girl was distinctly audible in the court, and all heads turned to the door. In the general wonder, no one noticed the change that passed over Rufus Dawes. His face flushed scarlet, great drops of sweat stood out on the forehead, and his black eyes glared in the direction from whence the sound came, as though they could pierce the envious wood that separated him from the woman whose voice he heard. "Who is she?" he said in a low, hoarse voice to the constable behind him. "Miss Vickers," said the man shortly, flinging the information at him as one might fling a bone to a dangerous dog. "Miss Vickers," repeated the convict, still staring in a sort of bewildered agony. "They told me she was dead."
And Des, I believe you're going to take us on our first hashish trip, Australia's first literary...
It is. And I thought you selected a passage there that showed up some of the worst of Clarke.
Tried hard.
It is a better book than that. I'm just going to read a tiny passage from a story that Clarke published in 1868 called Cannabis Indica. And this kind of shows, I guess, the other side, the kind of the Bohemian, the city dweller, the kind of nightlife Clarke. And in this story, he has a sort of introduction where he has the an unnamed doctor that comes and spends the evening with him. He takes hashish, and then he dictates a story which is taken down by the doctor. So we have this sort of introduction by Clarke, we have the doctor's notes observing him, we have the story, and then we have the kind of follow-up by both of them. But there's a nice little part where he describes his room, and I think it's a kind of wonderful little evocation of Clarke's room in 1867, which would have been above, I think, the Argus office in Collins Street, and you kind of get this sense of that Bohemian haunt of the period. He states, "On the 17th of December, he came to my house at about 5 o'clock in the evening." This is the doctor. "Having partaken of a very light dinner, I determined to submit myself to the experiment. It was agreed that as soon as I found myself under the complete influence of the narcotic, I should endeavour to dictate some story or compose some poem, which Doctor would take down. I requested him also to make notes of my appearance and actions at various times. Before I proceed further, a short description of the room in which the experiment took place may be interesting. I have spoken to the effect that external objects have upon the faculties of the dreamer, and it is beyond question that many of the incidents related in the narrative which follows were unconsciously suggested by the pictures, books and ornaments in the chamber. I have also added footnotes to the story, as it was originally written down by Doctor, with the intention of explaining whatever I could how the ideas arose. The room is oblong with 2 windows fronting the street. The door is opposite to the windows. A fireplace with a mantel shelf and looking glass is at one end of the chamber, and a bookcase at the other. Over the looking glass is a mezzo-tint engraving of an Italian monk, the face being a strange and startlingly lifelike nature. A large engraving of Martin's Palace of Satan occupies the place of honour over the bookcase, and on each side are two engravings after Holbein, descriptive of the entrance of death amongst the party of revellers, and death tolling a bell in a church tower. On one side of the fireplace is a writing table loaded with books and papers, and on the wall above it hangs a chromolithograph of one of Burkitt Foster's woodland pieces. On the wall, fronting the windows, is another low bookcase with two Art Union Perrine statues, one a bust, Cleet, the other the dancing girl. Above them is a watercolour picture by Catamol of a party of Breton peasants riding by the seashore. On the mantel shelf is a French clock, surmounted by a statue of the Indian Bacchus in bronze, and a sea-piece hangs between the windows. A table in the centre of the room was covered with books, among which I noticed Le Conte Drôlatique of Balzac, Montaigne's Essays, translated by Hazlitt, Doré's Dante, several numbers of the Journal Amusant, some Saturday reviews, an illustrated edition of Keats. During the day, I had been doing some literary work of an utterly unimaginative character, and had been reading Balzac's Gobseck in the afternoon. Doctor and I had been conversing during dinner on indifferent subjects, but I must confess that in my mind, at least, the idea of the approaching experiment was paramount, and I was constantly wondering what sort of visions would result from the effects of the drug. It's kind of very different, kind of Marcus Clarke, I think.
You can read that in the portable Marcus Clarke, and it is one hell of a trip. And of course, he ends up in the Black Forest of Germany, and hooded monks take pursuit. I would like to read a little bit about from his Lower Bohemia series. And as Des mentioned, Balzac was a great influence on Clarke, and he actually had the romantic view, which Balzac promoted, that you could step into the shoes of someone else, like a method actor, and cross over the borders of class and become a vagrant, or go to, as in this case, the immigrants' home for homeless people in Melbourne. And, you know, for us, it's obvious he's a journalist on a bit of a holiday, writing sensational exposés. But at the same time, he brought these matters to the attention of the wealthy in Melbourne at a time Manning Clark described as the golden age of the bourgeoisie. And he was always quick to say, just outside your carriage window, this is happening in Melbourne, just around the corner from the library, just around the corner from the Café de Paris. Now, this is A Night at the Immigrant's Home, 1869. The kingdom of Bohemia is divided into parts. There is Upper Bohemia, the land of freedom and wit and pleasure, sparkling with supper parties and radiant with beauty. But there is another Bohemia, where there are few suppers and no supper parties, where no songs are sung and no wine cups circulate, where vice is vice without the tinsel, and vagabondage is stripped of its poetry. This is the real Bohemia. But if you would absolutely know what Bohemia means, you must hire a loafer's suit of clothes, leave your watch on the mantelpiece, and come with me. I will take you Dante-like on an excursion through a real inferno where rags and poverty and drunkenness and crime and misery all huddle together. Has it ever occurred to you, reader, what would you do if by some wild chance you were compelled to sleep out all night? Every night. The immigrant's home is the only place in Melbourne where a man can obtain supper and bed for nothing. And I will tell you what he sees and what he does when he goes there. And he goes on about that awful, terrible sights. He did another series called Melbourne at Midnight, which goes into Lower Bohemia as well. This one is 1868 in the Argus. And I like the modernity of this passage. He goes into a bar down near the wharves. On each side are covered bars where some 20 or 30 girls dispense with lightning rapidity. The brandy's hot, glass of ale, cold without, colonial wine, novelist for 5, whiskey's hot, sherry bitters, 2 glasses of claret, novelist for 2, dark brandy, etc. which expectorating crowds of men and boys call for on all sides. White-coated waiters shoot like meteors through the mass. Walking up the street, we meet a knot of station men from the Murray with cattle runs. They've just put up their horses preparatory to going on the bust, and walk down the pavement 4 abreast, all booted, breeched and smoking violently. Presently we come upon a group of celestials, pigtailed, blue-coated and mandarin-capped, chattering in their teeth-breaking lingo. These turn down Little Burke Street into an opium house and will probably spend the remainder of the night in gambling away their hard-earned gains. Dirty and draggle-tailed women begin to appear at the ends of right-of-ways, and the popular music halls have just vomited forth a crew of drunken sailors, while in some of the doorways, flaunting but shabbily dressed women peer forth like spiders from their web on the lookout for prey. It goes on to say how hansom cabs are used by prostitutes to drag customers in, and then they get more than they bargain for and pay for more than they bargain for. But what I find interesting in Clarke is this modernity of his urban, this notion of being like Baudelaire and Balzac, a flaneur who wanders Melbourne, sits in his cafe in Collins Street and observes the city and tells this new market of readers about their city, and this, what he sees as a phenomena of, basically a tent town in 30, 40 years becoming one of the great metropolises of the empire. And it's not the Melbourne, the grand old dame Melbourne, it's this grasping Melbourne that, as a Sydney sider, sounds more like Sydney on a good day, I have to say. Money, money, money. And then he says, and you're all greedy, and he sees himself as more aristocratic, and yet he goes all the way down. What do you, both of you, I'd be interested in what you put his collapse of his powers, as they say, down to.
God, I don't know, probably too long spent in the library, I suspect. Actually, I mean, this is getting away from your question, which I'll leave Des to answer at more respectable length, but it makes me wonder, you were talking about his early death, untimely death. What would have he made of the State Library had he won the job of chief librarian? How might the library have taken a different swerving direction?
Waxworks, strip
well,
parlour.
who knows? It could have been anything. I love to think about the Clarkian State Library.
The Clarkian years.
Yeah,
I think that's too much of a what if. I can't even go there.
I don't know. Was it booze? I'm not sure. None of us knows.
Well, I think, it's kind of interesting. I think what we're saying in a way, Clarke was able to practice that sort of modernity in journalism, and that's one of the ironies. Because the kind of serial literature which sold was that sensational literature. And one of the ironies is that in fact, his natural life, which still, is mired in that sort of sensational literature, lost huge numbers of readers for the Australian Journal. Messina, who ran the Australian Journal, was just, appalled by the fact that Clarke's serial just went on and on and on. He was a hopeless money manager. He was paid £100 to write his natural life. He said it would run over 12 issues, over 12 months. It ran for 27 months, so in fact he spent another year and a half, in fact, without pay, cranking it out. In its original form as a serial novel, it wasn't published in its entirety till 1970, when Penguin brought out Stephen Murray Smith's complete edition, and it runs to over 900 pages. It's a staggeringly large...
That would have taken a lot out of him.
Novel, and it did take a lot out. And he staggered in, I think, with the last piece for Messina, and uttered, "Thank God." And that term turns up again, in fact, because he then spent 2 years revising the novel drastically, and he didn't want to. But at the advice of Gavin Duffy and others who stated that it should be like this. As you say, he trimmed the opening section of the novel from 40,000 words down to 4,000 words, completely changed the whole motivation of Richard Devine's crime. In fact, I think his friend J.J. Shillinglaw claims credit for that and says he said to Clarke, to commit a crime like that, not admit to it, it's got to be the mother. The only thing that would do
Not
that.
the butler.
It can't be the butler, it's the mother. And then in the final part of the novel, he trims 170,000 words almost to 2 years' work. And the copy that we have in the State Library, which was Shillinglaw's copy, has on the front, you know, to Shilling Law, thank God. So it's 4 years of his life during a time where he's working at the Melbourne Public Library.
And
he's cranking out six children. He's cranking out amazing amounts of journalism.
Of other writing.
And to a certain extent, I think you can say, you know, he just burnt himself out.
So can I just ask here, how was he having a good time? How was he a bohemian in any sense that we understand that word?
All you have to do is read the accounts of
was
cafes,
he making it up,
restaurants.
I want to know if he was making it up.
No,
because
I think
he was working bloody hard. He was cranking out the 6 kids. Even when he had an affair, it was with his sister-in-law, so he wasn't straying far from home. He was working in a library, for God's sake.
Well, if you look at his bills, I think
the
bills tell the tale. He's got a flat in town. He is often there. No
wonder he didn't have any money.
He's trying. For me, it's the tension between wanting to be that which he aspired to be, which is a Victorian gentleman in every sense of the word. Melbourne Club. When he married an actress, which wasn't quite the done thing. Her name was Dunn. Her father. The only picture of her father is, I have to say, was a theatre manager, a great actor of the time. He is wearing a dress and looks like Dame Edna. That's the father-in-law come over for the night. But he marries the actress, makes her a respectable woman by buying livery, carriages, servants, gets a house out in the burbs, what was then the hinterland, yet he maintains the flat. When the Yorick Club becomes too respectable, and this ultimately becomes the Savage Club, when it becomes too respectable after a few years, he leaves and forms a more out-there club, the Cave of Adullam, where all sorts of things go on. There's a novel he's written about, a comic novel about the Cave of Adullam, which is full of crazy hijinks and a lot of drinking. Wilding disputes that he drank that much, but there are accounts of him drinking absinthe, smoking opium, eating opium, and he says, people tell stories about this stuff, it's not that bad for you. So he's burning the candle at both ends, and ultimately the expenditure is unsustainable. He goes bankrupt. He loses his job at the library. It's his second bankruptcy. And he makes these attacks. He says God doesn't exist in a pamphlet, Civilization Without Delusion. He has the little history war about the extermination of Aborigines in Tasmania. He is having fights about what he's saying about convicts, and he has the play band. And I just think he has a series mocking the gentlemen of Melbourne. So I think, and there's the business with the newspapers breaking the boycott. Isn't there, of the Argus and other papers are not allowed to report the Melbourne.
That was an earlier one, because there was which is almost like today, where I think the Argus chooses not to report the Melbourne Cup because, in fact, they haven't been provided with free tickets for their journalists. And so Clarke, who's on staff at the Argus, ends up, of course, writing an account and publishes it in the Herald. And he gets sacked from the Argus. And that's where, in fact, the hoax comes in, because they later claim that, in fact,
he broadcast it.
He watched it with a camera obscura set up on the Herald's roof. So he was able to sit at a table in the Herald office and watch. I think he could see 90% of the track, not 10%. And he was able to make his report without actually going to the track. So he hadn't, in fact, gone against the embargo. And in fact, as you say, people turned up to actually look at this amazing device, which would allow you to
another
do
50, 60 years before they televised the Melbourne, 80 years before they televised the Melbourne Cup.
But he was a hopeless money manager. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And in terms of the wine, I think his first bankruptcy, amongst the various bills, I think at least 3 to wine merchants of several £100s each. It's quite,
which is a lot of money back then.
Substantial.
Yeah.
Would you all join me in thanking our panel and the Wheeler Centre for tonight?
Thanks, Tony.